D&D 5th edition is great. It's easy to learn, easy to buy, easy to find players for. One problem 5th edition DMs do have is finding enough adventures to keep their weekly game moving along. If you've run into this problem, there are two solutions. Before I delve into those, I'd like to take a few seconds to tell you about our design studio, Dark House Rules Games. We offer everything from adventures and campaign expansions to maps and monsters. Do you need an NPC or magic item? We've got you covered. Just looking for a character portrait or other game art? We'll look no further. Dark House Rules Games has all your gaming needs in one place. Check us out at our Subscribestar page, updated monthly. See the description below for the link. Now back to fixing the problem of 5th edition not having enough products to run a weekly game. Solution number 1. Start making up your own adventures, and string those adventures into an open-ended campaign. This can make for a very enjoyable gaming experience. I'll be making a video about how to make your own campaign soon. Be sure to subscribe to this channel so you don't miss it when it comes out. Solution number 2. The second option is to look back at older editions and convert the plethora of great adventures that can be found there. Most of the adventures Wizards of the Coast has published for 5th edition have actually been conversions of old 1st, 2nd, and to a lesser extent 3rd edition adventures. Even Matt Colville leans heavily on the 2nd edition epic adventure A Night Below for most of the Underdark portion of his homebrew campaign setting. This just goes to show that there's lots of great stuff from earlier editions that you can reskin and use in your 5th edition game. So how do you go about converting old adventures to 5th edition, and what edition has the most stuff to choose from? Let us explore the second question first. What edition, if you learn to convert it to 5th edition, would give you the widest variety of materials to use for your games? Most players or DMs who've been playing for less than 20 years would probably say 3rd edition or 3.5. This is because of the two editions' similarities and the large number of products that were released for 3.5. This answer is wrong, though. Sure, you can find a lot of good products to work with in 3rd edition 3.5, but they combined are dwarfed by 2nd edition Advanced Dungeons & Dragons. AD&D 2nd edition is by far the edition with the most product depth. On top of that, like 3.5 was a fix for 3rd edition, 2E is a cleaned up, beefed up version of 1st edition. So if you learn 2nd edition, you can use all the 1st edition stuff too. In addition to that, 2E has the most variety. If you're looking for something in particular, chances are 2nd edition has it. There are 12 to 18 campaign settings depending on how you count them, each with their own set of campaign materials and adventures. A good portion of the AD&D 1st and 2nd edition products are available on the DM's Guild and Drive-Thru RPG at heavily discounted prices. Like all other editions, the 3 core rules books, the Player's Handbook, DMG, and Monstrous Manual, are all that is required to run the game. Unlike most other editions, the core rules books branch out into scores of other products that can be used if the DM wishes to expand their toolbox. Now that we have chosen AD&D 2nd edition to focus on, what do you need to know to do the conversion? How do the two editions differ, and how do we overcome those differences? To answer these questions, I'm going to go through the 2nd edition and 5th edition Player's Handbook and Monstrous Manuals to show the mechanical and style departures between the two and how they can be converted from old to new. Because of the scope of this task, I will break it into 3 parts. In this video, the first part, I will cover converting ability scores, 2nd edition classes and races, to 5th edition. The second video will show you how to deal with 2E weapon, non-weapon proficiencies, saving throws, magic, and the big one, THAC0. That will be released next week. Finally, in 2 weeks, the last video will walk you through converting the thousands of 2nd edition monsters into something that will catch your 5th edition players unawares. To make this video more user-friendly, I will add timestamps to the video description so you can skip forward to the parts you need easily. This will allow you to use this video as a resource while you are converting 2nd edition adventures in the future. Let's start with the 6 basic ability scores. Although there are the same 6 stats in both editions, the meaning of each ability score has changed somewhat over the decades. Which stats are the most important, and how differently are they used in-game? Let's talk about the disparate styles of the two games and how their use of ability scores reflects those styles. Unlike 5th edition, where dexterity and charisma are king, the stats in 2e each have their role in-game to play. Although if you're running a role-playing light game, or the opposite, where the DM actually expects the players to have to talk their way through or out of things, then charisma may not be very important at all. Each class has stats that it relies on to play the game, and the game itself sometimes requires players to make ability checks equivalent to ability saves in 5e, depending on the situation. When looking at any AD&D product, realize that in combat, strength, dexterity, and constitution were very important. You may have to transfer a few points of the strength or constitution stats to dexterity or charisma to make NPCs work better in 5th edition. One other important thing to note about 2e ability scores was that each had a whole range of secondary stats that were tied to it. They didn't just add flat bonuses to rolls like they do in 5th edition. Here is an example of that. See here on Table 1 from the AD&D 2nd Edition Revised Player's Handbook, strength is linked to a wide range of game mechanics. As you can see, strength is broken up differently when a PC has an 18 in that stat. To convert this, I would advise to look at the damage modifier in the percentile strength section and convert the PC's/NPC's strength to one that equals that bonus in 5th edition. Example, an NPC with a 2e strength of 1891-99 would become a strength of 20 in 5e. Only warriors use the percentile strength. All other classes usually stop at 18 for strength. Athassian PCs/NPCs being an exception to this. All other stats have multiple game mechanics associated with them as well. One last note about ability scores. Unlike 5th edition, player characters' stats don't increase as they level up. Due to this, you may notice that some mid to high level 2nd edition NPCs have lower stats than you might expect, because their ability scores have not been added to every few levels. Depending on your needs, you may want to adjust such NPCs' ability scores to make them work better as 5th edition NPCs. From stats, we'll move on to NPC races. This is one of the biggest voids between the two editions, but at the same time it's one of the easiest to hand wave off. There are 6 races covered in the 2nd edition Player's Handbook: Dwarf, Elf, Gnome, Human, Half-Elf, and Halfling. Scores of others are available in products like the Complete Book of Humanoids, as well as the Dark Sun and Planescape product lines. Of the original 6 races, humans, dwarves, half-elves, and elves are similar enough to be run with little to no conversion. Halflings have changed a bit. You may want to make sure that one of their 2e special abilities is not being relied on in the adventure you're converting. Run them more like Bilbo, Frodo, or Samwise than you would a modern halfling that has more Pippin and Merry in them. Gnomes have undergone the biggest change, although it's mostly cosmetic. In 2nd edition, gnomes were very much like friendlier, bigger-nosed, shorter dwarves. They were more like a cross between a 5e forest gnome and a dwarf than the standard 5th edition gnome that seems to be drawn from Krynnish tinker gnomes. In all cases, try to preserve the feel of the NPC over making it fit into the 5th edition mold. This is a good rule of thumb for all parts of the conversion process. Next up are classes. There are also many differences between 2nd and 5th edition here too. Some seem large but are little more than how bookkeeping is handled. An example of this would be spell slots versus Vancian memorization of spells. When converting from 2nd edition to 5th edition, just make sure any spellcaster has enough slots to handle the number of spells that would have been available to the caster before their conversion. This is usually not a problem. 5e gives PCs much more power than 2e did. Now let's take a look at the classes and go in the order the classes are explained in the 2e Player's Handbook. The 2e Player's Handbook breaks classes down into 4 class groups: warriors, wizards, priests, and rogues. 2 of these have 3 classes and the other 2 have only 2. Starting with the warrior group that contains fighters, rangers, and paladins, Fighters are warriors who are good at armed combat and at higher levels leading soldiers. Rangers are kind of a cross between druids, thieves, and fighters. They are good trackers, animal handlers, and can dual wield with much less trouble than other classes. Paladins once again are a composite class like rangers. They have the fighting ability of warriors and some of the faith-based abilities of priests. They have a large number of special abilities, but are also the most limited when it comes to the range of acceptable behavior. Things all warriors have in common is their THAC0 improves every time they level up. I will explain THAC0 in the next video in this series. They have multiple attacks around that increase in number as they raise in level, and they use a D10 for their hit die. Shown here is Table 15 from the 2nd edition Player's Handbook Revised. It gives the number of attacks all warriors make per round when using a weapon they are not specialized in. Okay, so how do you convert a 2nd edition fighter to one for 5th edition? As in 5th edition, 2nd edition fighters are very basic and easy to play characters. They only have 3 things that make them stand out from other warriors. One of those things is that they advance faster than other warriors. See Table 14 from the 2nd edition Player's Handbook Revised. Another thing that makes fighters fighters is the fact that they become lords and gain a large number of followers, although this does not happen until 9th level. The most important thing that distinguishes fighters from other warrior classes found in the Player's Handbook is that they can specialize in a certain weapon. To explain weapon specialization, I'll first need to give you a primer in the 2nd edition proficiency system. This system is presented as a set of optional rules in the Player's Handbook, particularly the non-weapons half of the proficiency rules. Almost all 2nd edition products that contain NPCs use the proficiency system though, so it is treated as an essential part of the rules outside the Player's Handbook. I will cover the weapon proficiency rules now and leave the non-weapon proficiency rules for the next video. During character creation, each character receives both weapon and non-weapon proficiency slots to spend as they wish. The number of these are determined primarily by the character's class, although the more exotic races sometimes give bonus weapon proficiency slots for a particular weapon. One example of this would be Thrycreen gaining proficiency in Chakachka upon reaching 5th level as a racial bonus. Here you can see Table 34 from the 2nd edition Player's Handbook Revised. It shows the weapon and non-weapon proficiency slots each class group receives upon creation, and how often they gain another slot to spend. It also gives the penalty each class suffers for using a weapon they are not proficient in. As you can see from the table, a fighter belonging to the warrior group receives 4 weapon proficiency slots to spend at creation. To become proficient in a weapon, a character must spend a weapon proficiency slot in that type of weapon. Becoming proficient allows the character to avoid non-proficient penalties and halves those penalties for weapons similar to the weapon the character is proficient with. Proficiency in a weapon gives no bonuses to most weapons. Aside from a few exceptions from settings like Dark Sun, it only negates penalties. To gain a bonus with a weapon type, a character must devote extra proficiency slots to mastering that type of weapon. To become specialized in a type of weapon, a fighter must spend 1 extra proficiency slot for all melee weapons and crossbows, and 2 extra slots for all non-crossbow bows such as longbows and short bows. Of all the classes in the 2nd edition Player's Handbook, only single-classed fighters can specialize, and they can only specialize in 1 weapon. In the Dark Sun setting, gladiators can specialize as well, but that is beyond the scope of this video, so I will say no more about them here. So what do fighters get for pouring their extra slots into 1 weapon? They receive bonuses both to hit and damage, as well as extra attacks per round beyond those of other warriors. For all melee weapons, a fighter using the weapon they are specialized in get a +1 to attack and +2 to damage rolls made with that type of weapon. These bonuses stack with any bonuses for strength, blessings, situational modifiers, and magic bonuses. The second part of the advantage to specializing, extra attacks, is explained by Table 35, shown here from the 2nd edition Player's Handbook Revised. As you can see, with a melee weapon he is specialized in, a fighter can attack 3 times in 2 rounds, starting at 1st level instead of having to wait until 6th level like other warriors that are not specialized in that type of melee weapon. Different types of weapons infer different numbers of attacks. Non-crossbow bows, instead of giving extra attacks, allow additional range categories to be used. So how do you convert this to 5th edition? Considering we are mainly talking about NPCs, the gaining of followers at 9th level can be handled as a story element of the NPC's background easily enough. As for fighters requiring fewer experience points to level up, depending on the level of the party the fighter is running with, if they have one, just make them a level or 2 higher than the other warriors in the group. That leaves us with how to handle weapons specialization. You can approach this a couple of ways depending on your preference and needs. One would be to transplant the weapon specialization rules over to your 5th edition game. As long as the players and NPCs have equal access to this set of rules, it would work okay. You might want to cut out some of the 5e rules that attempt to do something similar to lessen the redundancy. The other way you could go is just to see what weapon the NPC is specialized in and choose a fighting style and martial archetype that closely fits the feel of the NPC. Now let's move on to paladins. The paladins of AD&D were much harder to roll up, requiring 4 high prerequisite scores and much harder to run than those in 5th edition. They were intended to give advanced players, who happened to roll well, something challenging and rewarding to play. Only lawful good characters could be paladins. They had to stay on the straight and narrow or lose their special abilities. If that happened, they were little more than fighters without the ability to specialize. When it comes to a paladin's special class abilities, most of them have survived more or less intact from 2nd to 5th edition. For the most part, a 2nd edition paladin should convert to an Oath of Devotion 5th edition paladin without much trouble. The only 2 things that a 2nd edition paladin will receive at some point in their career that Oath of Devotion paladins do not are a warhorse and a holy sword. Because we are converting NPCs, this can be easily covered by the NPC paladin's backstory. The only major difference, aside from the long list of things 2e paladins are prohibited from doing, is 2e paladins don't have Divine Smite, so don't waste your time looking for it. Just add it to the NPC paladin's list of abilities when you convert him or her over. Up next is the last of the warrior group, the ranger. Like the paladin, a ranger in 2nd edition has 4 prerequisite scores that must be met, so they are hard to roll up. They are also all of good alignment, although the other half of their alignment isn't important to their class. Most, if not all, of the 2e ranger abilities have been preserved through the editions and are present in the 5th edition ranger. You will have to mix the archetypes though to get everything the standard 2e ranger had. One other difference you may find when looking at 2nd edition rangers is that although they have spellcasting ability, they can't use it until much later in their adventuring career than their 5th edition counterparts. The same is true of paladins and bards as well. What this means is you may have to come up with spells for any of those 3 classes of NPCs you convert. This brings us to the second group of classes, the wizard group. This group includes mages and specialist wizards. The 2nd edition Player's Handbook concentrates on mages and gives one example of a specialist wizard type, that being the illusionist. Later products from 2nd edition, such as the Tome of Magic and the Complete Wizard's Handbook, introduce other kinds of wizards such as specialist wizards, elemental wizards, and wild mages. But those are beyond what we're going to cover here. You should be able to use the information I give you here and those 2e products to convert those types of wizards if need be. things all wizards have in common are they use wizardly magic. I'll go more in depth into that in a few seconds. Their Thacos improve 1 every 3 levels, and they all use a D4 as their hit die. Because of this, you may want to add about 50% of their hit points when converting them to 5th edition. To clear up any confusion caused by the same words meaning different things in the 2 editions, let me define what it means when you see the class and class group names in AD&D. The term wizard applies to anyone who uses arcane, or as they were called, wizardly spells, as the main defining feature of their class. This could be applied to mages, specialists, elementalists, and wild mages. This word is sometimes used interchangeably with the words mage or magic user. It will not be used to describe classes that gain wizard spells later in their adventuring career, such as bards, because magic is not their main focus. A mage is a kind of wizard that does not specialize. They can use spells from any school of magic and are only restricted by whether or not they have the spells available and by the spell casting level they have mastered. A specialist wizard, as the name implies, specializes in one school of magic. This gives them advantages when trying to learn spells from that school, and sometimes even bonuses to save against spells from their chosen school of specialization. Because they have spent so much time learning the one school they specialize in, they are unable to learn spells from the opposing school, and suffer penalties when trying to save against such spells. One major difference you may notice when converting spell-casting NPCs from 2nd edition to 5th edition is that there are 2 major groups that spells are categorized into in 2e. Those groups are wizardly or arcane spells and priestly or divine spells. All spell-casting classes draw from one of these 2 groups. These groups are further broken down into schools for wizardly magic and spheres for priestly magic. Depending on the class of the NPC being converted, they will have access to one of these groups, and their access may be further limited by the schools or spheres of magic they can access. Although this is a little more complicated than the 5e way of breaking each spell-casting class into its own spell list, it oftentimes gives NPCs a wider range of spells to choose from. Because of this, you may have to swap spells around while converting spell-casting NPCs. They may have spells that their 5e counterparts can't cast, or that don't exist in 5e. The biggest difference between wizards of 2nd edition and those of 5th edition are these. Number 1. The way they utilize their spells. In 2e, wizards use something like Vancian magic, where every day the wizard sat down and memorized spells. Spells stayed in their memory until used, so they could be held over from the previous day. When a spell was cast, it left the memory of the wizard, and they were unable to cast that spell until it was time to memorize spells again. Wizards could memorize the same spell more than once in a day, as long as they had room in their memory. See Table 21 of the 2e Player's Handbook Revised to determine the number of spells a wizard could memorize at a given experience level. Wizards needed at least a day between memorization sessions, so spells were only regained once a day. This should not inhibit you from converting a wizard to one that uses spell slots, but knowing it may help you understand why an NPC wizard is written up the way they are. Number 2 major difference. Cantrips. In 2nd edition, cantrips are just practice spells that 0th level wizards use to learn the rudiments of magic. They can be used to do almost anything small, but they can't directly cause damage. They can only affect small things, and their range is very limited. They can't reproduce the effects of other spells, but they count as a spell against the number of 1st level spells a wizard can memorize per day. Because of these things, you won't see cantrip in very many NPC spell lists. Difference number 3. 5e wizards are like a combination of 2e mages and specialists. You can easily make a 2nd edition mage work as a 5th edition wizard by adjusting their spell list to match the arcane tradition that they would have access to at their level. Difference number 4. 2E wizards use a D4 for their hit dice while 5E wizards use a D6. This means it's not at all uncommon for a 10th level 2nd edition mage to have 20 hit points. Many people nowadays think 2E was not balanced, but this is an example of how it was balanced, only in a more subtle way than the later editions. In 5E, a 10th level wizard is way more powerful than a 10th level fighter. In 2E, if a 10th level fighter gets into melee range with a 10th level mage, barring a miracle delivered by the dice, it's all over but the crime for the mage. Wizards in 2E had powerful spells, but they could not wear heavy armor and had few hit points. They were not meant to stand toe-to-toe with their opponents and slug it out. They were meant to stand behind their warrior friends or on top of a high wall and rain death down on their enemies. Moving on, we come to the third class group, the priests. The priest group contains 2 types of clerics, good-evil and specialist clerics, as well as druids. Many more priest classes and kits were introduced in later products such as the Tome of Magic, Legends and Lore, the Complete Priest's Handbook, and almost every campaign setting box set. You should be able to use the information found here to convert the priests found in those products as well. Things all 2E priests have in common are: they all used the priestly magic spell list to draw their spells from. They also all had a D8 for their hit die, and their THAC0 improved by 2 for every 3 levels of advancement. This is second only to the warrior group. Because of this, the priests of the party may be called upon to fill out the front line of the party's fighting formation or bring up the rear of the party while traveling. All priests serve a higher power, whether that power is a particular god such as Thor, or the concepts of righteousness and wickedness, or nature itself. All priests worship something. Just as wizards have to daily memorize their spells to cast them, so too do priests have to pray for their spells. This is done on a daily basis. Beyond this, many priests have the power to heal and turn undead. What an individual priest can do depends upon what they worship and what level they are. Before we delve too deep into the various priest classes, we should take a short look at the type of spells they can cast. For the most part, the restrictions on spells that priests can cast work in similar ways in both 2 and 5e. In 2nd edition, priests have access to certain spheres of magic, while in 5th edition, these are represented by divine domains. As with everything from 2e, spheres of magic are finer tuned than the 5e divine domains. There are 16 different spheres of priestly magic in the player's handbook, with more introduced in later products. Each type of priest has access to at least one of these spheres, and some have many to choose from. They have either minor or major access to certain spheres. Having only minor access to a sphere means that a priest can only cast 1st to 3rd level spells from that sphere, given that priest is high enough level to cast 3rd or higher level spells. Major access to a sphere allows priests to cast up to the maximum level of priest spells. Except for in the Dark Sun setting, priest spells top out at 7th level in 2nd edition. One more note about priestly magic as opposed to wizardly magic in 2nd edition is that the 2 groups of spells do not overlap. Priest spells are for priests and wizard spells are for wizards. There are a few gods that allow priests to have special abilities that are effectively like casting a particular wizard's spell, but these are a rare exception. If you look over the 2nd edition wizard and priest spell lists, you will see they are completely different. They do not share any spells. Unlike 5th edition where spells are spells, and each class's list is drawn from the same large pile. Let's start our look at priests with the very simplified good or evil cleric. Then we can move on to the more specialized clerics who worship a named god. Then we can finish up priests by checking out druids. The simplest kind of priest, and in my mind the most nonsensical, were those who worshiped nothing in particular. They were either good or evil. They were meant for fast play or one-shots. where figuring out the details would get in the way of getting the game started. These clerics are the foundation that most specialist priests are built off of. In a way, they are the easiest 2nd edition priests to convert to 5th edition. They share many of the same basic concepts and abilities with 5th edition clerics. They do differ in a few points though. Some of these are, while a 5e cleric is limited to medium armor or less and a shield, 2e good evil clerics can wear any armor. 5e clerics are unrestricted in their choice of weapons, whereas 2nd edition good evil clerics are only allowed bludgeoning weapons. While all clerics in 5e are limited to the spells allowed by their divine domain, 2e good evil clerics have major access to all spheres except elemental, which they have minor access to, animal, plant, and weather, which they have no access to. While 2nd edition good clerics can gain the ability to turn and destroy undead in a similar manner to 5th edition clerics, see Table 61 from the revised 2nd edition Player's Handbook, 2nd edition evil clerics could not. They instead had a chance to control undead. Providing the 2e good evil cleric had built a stronghold, at 8th level they could attract 20 to 200 0th level warriors that were devoted to the same faith as they were. This, like the followers gained by fighters, can just be explained as part of the history of any NPC 2e cleric you convert to 5e. One last difference between 2nd edition clerics of all types and 5th edition clerics is that they advanced through their experience levels faster than druids early on when druids were more powerful. As the cleric class started to surpass the druid in power, the druid then advanced faster. All classes in 5th edition use the same experience table shown here, the character advancement table on page 15 of the 5th edition Player's Handbook. This is one other example of the way 2e was more subtly balanced than 5e. The classes with a lot of special powers were harder to roll up, having more stringent prerequisite scores, and they advanced slower. As you can see here looking at Table 23 of the 2nd edition Player's Handbook Revised, becoming a 4th level 2nd edition druid required 25% more experience points than a 4th level 2nd edition cleric. To reach 5th level though, the trend reverses itself. At this point, the powers available to the cleric outstrip those available to the druid, so the cleric's advancement is slowed. Okay, that has the cleric basics out of the way. Now let's talk about clerics that worshipped a named god. These use most of the same rules as the good evil clerics do, with exceptions that depended on the god they worshiped. While a non-specific cleric only needed a 9 wisdom to become a cleric, one devoted to a particular god may have had more stringent requirements. Class prerequisites should not affect your ability to convert 2e NPC clerics into 5e. Since 5e has no prerequisites for any class, any 2e cleric should have no trouble meeting the non-existent requirements for 5th edition. Class prerequisites are yet another example of 2e balance. Only rare characters had the high ability scores necessary to qualify for the more powerful and specialized classes. The base class for every group was easy to qualify for, only requiring a 9 for whatever the prerequisite for that class was. In the case of clerics, the ability score was wisdom. If a player wanted to play something special, they had to roll something special. Beyond prerequisite ability scores, specialist clerics also differed from good evil clerics in the weapons they could use. Depending on the god they worship, they might not be restricted in their choice of weapons, or they might be limited to only a quarterstaff. The spells each god granted their clerics varied widely as well. Each had its spheres that they allowed access to and ones they did not. It really depended on the god's profile, what spells they would make available to their clerics. As I said before, some gods gave their clerics the power to turn or control undead, while some gave their clerics no power over the undead at all. Most gods gave their priests some special powers that allowed the cleric to do the work the god had charged them with. For instance, the Egyptian god Set granted several special powers to his clerics, one of which was immunity to all poisons and venom. When converting clerics from 2nd edition to 5th edition, you can try to make the 2e cleric fit into a particular divine domain and use the scant information about gods on pages 10 through 13 of the 5th edition DMG, but you will lose most of the flavor of the NPC cleric if you go that way. As I have said already several times in this video, it may be better to bring the 2e way of handling gods and clerics into your 5e game. Here is an example of a profile I wrote up for using Set and his clerics in 5e. I tried to use as many 5th edition clerical mechanics as I could while giving it a far more fleshed out 2nd edition feel. This profile of Set comes from the Ravenloft adventure I wrote for the DM's Guild called Ravenloft Prey of the Black Wolf. It is written in both 2nd edition and 5th edition rules, so it is a great example of how to convert one to the other. If you would like to give the rest of it a look, I have put the link to it in the description of this video. As you can see, using a profile for each god like this makes their clerics far more unique. As the DM, you have the information you need to make NPC clerics nuanced characters and not just flat two-dimensional caricatures. I think we are ready to address converting druids now. Just like in 5th edition, 2nd edition druids are priests of nature. They protect the wild places of the world and promote the natural order of things. The druids of 2e share some abilities with their 5th edition brethren, but have many differences as well that you need to be aware of when converting them to the new format. Most of these are things that can be handled as part of the NPC's history, so they don't pose much of a problem for conversion. The first difference that you may notice when trying to convert a druid is that in 2e, wisdom and charisma are the two most important scores to a druid, but now they are wisdom and intelligence. You may want to move a few points of the NPC druid's charisma over to their intelligence, if that score is too low for the druid to function properly in 5e. 2nd edition druids gain a +2 bonus to all saves versus fire and electrical attacks. There is no 5th edition equivalent to this, so either port it over from 2e or replace it with something 5e druids can do that 2e druids can't, of which there are many things. The druids of 2nd edition were much less combat oriented in their special abilities and much more focused on being one with nature. Although they did have their equivalent to wild shape, they were unable to use it until 7th level and it was less combat oriented. I will go into that in depth in just a few minutes. Back to the other special abilities of the 2e druid. Identify plants, animals, and pure water with 100% accuracy at 3rd level. Having the option to learn the languages of magical woodland creatures starting at 3rd level. Being able to pass through thick undergrowth at their normal movement rate without leaving a trail, also at 3rd level. Becoming immune to the charms of woodland creatures such as dryads and nixies at 7th level. Also at 7th level, druids gain the ability to shape change. This last ability is much like a limited version of the 5th edition druid ability Wild Shape. Because of the limitations of the 2e druid shape change ability, it would probably be best to replace it with Wild Shape so the NPC druid isn't underpowered. The last major difference between 2nd and 5th edition druids is the worldwide network of druids in 2e. This is something you may want to drop altogether, or you might just use it to further the depth and detail of your world. It is very restrictive, so if you decide to port it over into your 5e game, you may want to make it a separate tradition that most druids do not adhere to. That way PC druids can choose not to go through the restrictions it imposes on its members. That brings us at last to the final class group, the Rogues. The Rogue group includes 2 classes in the 2nd edition Player's Handbook. The first are Thieves, now known as Rogues in 5th edition, and the other are Bards. Thieves specialize in being sneaky. They have a whole array of skills that allow them to be great scouts, ambushers, and thieves. They can hide, sneak around, break in, climb out, and take whatever they want without being noticed. Bards, while having some of the thieves' skills, are best known as entertainers. Some are musicians while others are acrobats, and others still recite verse or tell jokes. Being jacks of all trades, 2e bards eventually learn a little magic. Of all the 2nd edition classes presented in the Player's Handbook, they are the most well-rounded. The things all rogues have in common are they have a d6 for their hit die, their THAC0 improves by 1 for every 2 levels of advancement. In the next video in this series I will explain THAC0 for those of you who don't know how it works. All rogues have a knack for languages, and thus they have a chance to understand new languages in the written form. They are all good climbers as well. Lastly, rogues have light fingers, allowing them to pick the pockets of the unwary. Let's start out the rogues with thieves. The thief class in the 2nd edition Player's Handbook is in some ways similar and in many ways different to the rogue of the 5th edition Player's Handbook. One of the differences you may notice is that thief NPCs from 2e have fewer hit points than their roguish counterparts from 5e. This is because they use a d6 instead of a d8 for their hit die. You may want to increase their hit points by 1/3 when converting them. Many of the thief skills survive from 2nd to 5th edition, but are different in when they are available and how they work mechanically. The 5e rogue has much less left to chance than the 2e thief. The rogue can let mechanics that are more likely than not to succeed do a lot of the work for them, while thieves have to have a good number of levels under their belts before they can have similar confidence in their skills. One big difference between the 2e thief and the 5e rogue is that the thief gets almost all its skills and special abilities at first level, just the majority of them don't work very well. The thief has to build their skills using the process of leveling up, deciding on which ones to improve at each level. This focuses the thief to specialize in 1 or 2 skills at first if they want to have more than a 20 or 30% chance of succeeding at anything. Thieves all had 8 basic thief skills. They were pickpockets, open locks, find and remove traps, move silently, hide in shadows, detect noise, climb walls, and read languages. As you can see here on Table 26 from the 2nd edition Revised Player's Handbook, the starting values of all but one of these skills, climb walls, are very low. During character creation, players of a thief character adjust these scores for race and dexterity using Table 27 and 28. After this, they are given 60 percentage points to distribute, giving no more than 30% to any skill. This gives the thief its thief skill percentages at first level. Every time they level up, the thief gains 30 percentage points to add to their skills. The maximum any skill can be improved per level is 15%. Because of this, thieves may have a better chance of failure than success at everything but climbing until 5th or 6th level, unless they specialize by pumping all their points into just 2 skills each time they level up. As far as converting this, it would probably work best to look at the thief and use the 5e rules for the thief archetype and pick the skills that best reproduce the 2e thief skills the NPC was best at in its own original form. As for all the other thief abilities, use sneak attack. It's easier and tops out higher than backstab. The thieves' cant works about the same in both, so using the 5th edition version should work fine. At 10th level, thieves gain the ability to read magical scrolls. This is like dipping a toe into the arcane trickster archetype, although it isn't one of their directly stated abilities. With this one you may want to either drop it or explain it with backstory. Maybe the thief ran with an arcane trickster or wizard and picked up the ability because of that. The 2e thief ability to attract a gang could also be explained by their history, just like the followers of a fighter or cleric. Nothing mechanical has to be changed there. 2nd edition thieves lack most of the thief special abilities that rogues have, so you will want to add cunning action, canny dodge, evasion, reliable talent, slippery mind, elusive, and stroke of luck, along with any abilities that come with the thief archetype as they are level appropriate. The Bard is the last of the classes presented in the 2nd edition Player's Handbook. Like several other classes in that book, Bards are not easy to make. They require 3 high prerequisite ability scores. This explains their rarity and the products from AD&D 2nd edition. One of the first differences you may notice is that Bard NPCs from 2e have fewer hit points than their Bard counterparts in 5e. This is because they use a d6 instead of a d8 for their hit die. You may want to increase their hit points by 1/3 when converting them. 2nd edition Bards are unlimited in their choice of weapons and can wear up to chainmail armor. Depending on the individual NPC you are converting, you may have to change the weapons and armor they are using to make them work for 5th edition. All 2e bards start out with bonus proficiencies in singing and gain 2 musical instrument proficiencies for every slot spent. This will mean using the equivalent 5e skills to allow the NPC bard to continue to perform the same functions. 2nd edition bards gain the ability to cast wizardly spells at 2nd level, while 5th edition bards start play with this ability. 2e bards have fewer spells, so as you can see with this side-by-side comparison of Table 32 from the 2nd edition Revised Player's Handbook and the Bard's Ability Progression table from the 5th edition Player's Handbook, you may also notice that 2e bards top out at 6th level spells, while 5e bards can learn spells all the way up to 9th level. One other difference that is true of all 2nd edition spellcasters is bards of that edition have no pool of cantrips to fall back on. See the explanation of 2e cantrips in the next video for more information on why this is. 2nd edition bards, like thieves, have a number of abilities with percentage chance of success that help them get in and out of sticky situations. These are climb walls, detect noise, pick pockets, and read languages. The starting values are shown on Table 33 from the 2nd edition Player's Handbook Revised. Just like the thief abilities, these scores are adjusted for dexterity and race using Tables 27 and 28 from the 2nd edition Player's Handbook Revised. Once that is done, the creator of the Bard has 20 percentage points to spread around as they see fit and get another 15 points for every additional skill level. Like with the thief, converting these bard skills will probably work best by just taking similar existing 5e skills. As for what 2e bardic college 2e bards best fit into, most of their special class abilities would best be represented in the 5e College of Valor bard. The 2nd edition bard's ability to inspire others is close to those of that 5th edition college. They have some traits that might fit into the College of Lore, but for the most part, College of Valor has them covered. Well, now that we have the basics of converting 2nd edition ability scores, races, and classes over to 5th edition behind us, I believe we have reached a good stopping point. In my next video, I will talk about some of the 2nd edition mechanics you will need to understand to convert 2e NPCs to 5e. These will be weapon and non-weapon proficiency, 2nd edition saving throws, magic, and THAC0. After that, there will be a 3rd video in this series that will cover converting 2e monsters to 5e. I hope you found this video helpful. Thank you for watching this video all the way through. If you like what we do on this channel, please leave a like on this video and subscribe to my channel to make sure you don't miss any upcoming videos. If you would like to support this channel in Dark House Rules Games Design Studio, you can pledge your support on my Subscribestar page, link in the video description. In return, you will get all manner of game accessories. Have a great day, happy gaming. Hope to see you again soon.